December 19, 1944. Across 3 combat theaters spanning 6 million square miles, American machine gunners filed 47,000 after-action reports. The numbers inside those reports would shatter 60 years of military engineering consensus. Gas-operated machine guns, the accepted standard, the proven technology, the design every expert agreed was superior, recorded a 34% stoppage rate under field conditions. Browning's recoil-operated guns, 3.2%. Same ammunition. Same soldiers, same war. One crucial difference. When John Moses Browning walked into the U.S. Ordnance Department in 1900 with his prototype, the room full of experts knew exactly what he'd done wrong. He'd built a machine gun that let the barrel move backward with every shot, using the recoil itself as the power source. Mechanically unsound, the procurement records documented. Introduces alignment issues, accelerates wear, reduces accuracy. Gas operation is the accepted standard. They dismissed it. For 40 years, they dismissed it, until the frozen tundra of Alaska, the suffocating humidity of the Pacific, and the 25,000-foot altitude of European bomber formations proved something the experts never imagined. The simplest mechanism was the deadliest. The conventional wisdom in 1900 was elegant in its certainty. Machine guns should harness the expanding gas from fired cartridges to power their cycling mechanisms. Hiram Maxim had proven this in 1884 with his recoil-operated design that the British Army adopted. No, wait. Maxim's design was actually recoil-operated, which made the British adoption even more interesting. But by the turn of the century, the emerging consensus favored gas operation. Tap off some of that explosive energy, route it through a gas tube to a piston. Use that force to eject the spent case and chamber a fresh round. The system was mechanically sophisticated, theoretically sound, and had proven itself in colonial wars across Africa and Asia when John Moses Browning entered the U.S. Ordnance Department's procurement office with a prototype that violated every principle of this emerging consensus. The experts in that room had every reason to be skeptical. Browning's pitch was simple to the point of seeming naive. Let the barrel itself move backward with the recoil. Use that rearward motion to unlock the bolt, eject the spent cartridge, and cycle the firing mechanism. Then let a heavy spring drive the barrel forward again, stripping a fresh round from the belt and slamming it into battery. Lock, fire, repeat. The entire cycle took 1/10 of a second. No gas tube. No piston, no adjustment screws. Just barrel, bolt, and spring. 3 major moving assemblies doing what the gun wanted to do naturally when it fired. The procurement officer's response was documented in official records with bureaucratic precision. Mechanically unsound. Introducing barrel movement creates alignment issues between barrel and receiver, accelerates wear on locking surfaces, reduces accuracy potential. Gas operation represents the accepted standard for automatic weapons development. The technical objections were reasonable. A moving barrel meant more mass in motion, which required heavier components to handle the battering. It meant looser tolerances to allow movement, which theoretically compromised precision. And it meant fighting decades of European precedent that said extracting gas was the modern, sophisticated approach to automatic fire. But there was something else at work beyond technical arguments. John Moses Browning was an American civilian inventor from Utah, a Mormon craftsman who'd learned gunsmithing from his father. He wasn't a European arms manufacturer with royal patents. He wasn't a West Point graduate with engineering credentials. He was a frontier tinkerer proposing that the most technologically advanced militaries in the world had been doing it wrong. The institutional resistance was predictable. Browning had started working on the recoil-operated concept in the 1890s, driven by a simple observation. Every gun generates enormous recoil energy that engineers spend tremendous effort trying to suppress or redirect. What if, instead of fighting that energy, you used it? The physics were straightforward. When a gun fires, the explosion pushes the bullet forward and the gun backward with equal force. Newton's third law. In a locked breech rifle, that rearward force is absorbed by the shooter's shoulder or a heavy mount. But what if you let the barrel move backward freely, capturing that energy to power the gun's reloading cycle? The concept wasn't entirely new. Hiram Maxim's 1884 machine gun had used a form of recoil operation, though his design was mechanically complex. Browning's innovation was to simplify the concept radically, reducing the number of parts and making the mechanism brutally straightforward. He built his first prototype in his Ogden, Utah workshop in 1899. The gun was ugly, a heavy steel barrel mounted in a receiver that looked overbuilt and crude compared to the elegant gas-operated designs emerging from European arsenals. But when Browning took it to a test range and fired several hundred rounds without a single malfunction, he knew he had something that worked. Getting the U.S. military to agree would be a different challenge entirely. By 1917, when American troops prepared to deploy to France, the U.S. military carried two types of machine guns into combat. French Hotchkiss M1914s, gas-operated and weighing 52 pounds, could deliver 450 rounds per minute from their strip-fed magazines. Browning M1917s, water-cooled and recoil-operated, weighed 103 pounds with water jacket and tripod mount, but matched the same rate of fire. Army procurement documents cited the weight difference as vindication of gas operation superiority. Recoil operation requires excessive mass to absorb mechanical stress, the analysis stated. This represents inefficient design philosophy unsuitable for modern warfare's mobility requirements. What those procurement reports never acknowledged was what Browning had seen during 2 decades of designing firearms in his Utah workshop. Gas-operated guns required additional components that recoil operation eliminated entirely. A gas tube to channel pressure from the barrel, a piston to convert that pressure into mechanical motion, adjustment screws to regulate gas flow for different ammunition types or environmental conditions, seals to prevent gas leakage. Each component represented a potential failure point, a place where fouling could accumulate, corrosion could form, or impact damage could disable the weapon. Browning's recoil system used the gun's own mass and momentum as the operating mechanism. It was mechanical judo, redirecting force rather than generating it. The gun world's response to Browning's death in 1926 was respectful but revealing. Obituaries praised his lever-action rifles and pump shotguns, but treated his obsession with recoil-operated automatic weapons as an interesting tangent rather than his central achievement. The British trusted their Vickers guns, refined from Maxim's original design. The Germans were developing the MG-34, which used recoil operation but with such mechanical complexity that it required 150 parts to function. The Americans hedged their institutional bets, maintaining production contracts for both gas and recoil designs without committing fully to either philosophy. By 1941, U.S. factories were manufacturing 4 distinct automatic weapon types in vast quantities. The M19-019 Browning, 30 caliber, cost $660 per unit and contained 42 parts. The water-cooled M19-17 Browning cost $2,165 and used 45 parts, the M2. Browning, 50 caliber. Browning's recoil design scaled up to aircraft and vehicle use. Cost $2,100 per gun with 44 parts. The competing Browning automatic rifle, or BAR, which used gas operation for reduced weight, cost just $319 but required 87 parts to function. Nobody had yet determined which design philosophy would dominate where it actually mattered: in the mud, blood, and chaos of sustained combat. The procurement debates continued in Washington offices and ordnance-proving grounds, technical arguments trading theoretical advantages back and forth like artillery fire. Gas operation offered weight savings and reduced felt recoil. Recoil operation provided mechanical simplicity and fewer precision parts. Gas systems could be tuned for different ammunition. Recoil systems required no adjustment, Each side could cite European precedents, metallurgical studies, and ballistic calculations supporting their position. What neither side possessed was comprehensive field data from actual combat, conditions testing reliability at scale. December 7, 1941, changed the nature of the debate permanently. When Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, every discussion of theoretical engineering elegance became irrelevant. Within 72 hours, American forces from the Aleutian Islands to the Philippines found themselves in combat carrying whichever automatic weapons the supply system had issued them. Some carried gas-operated bars. Some carried recoil-operated Brownings. None of them cared about procurement philosophy or engineering consensus. They cared about one question with brutal simplicity: which gun would keep firing when everything else, training, tactics, logistics, leadership, failed? The largest unplanned comparative study of automatic weapons design in military history had begun. Attu Island in May of 1943 was where physics began, overruling theory. The westernmost point of American territory sat wrapped in fog so thick that visibility dropped to 100 feet, with temperatures hovering at 28 degrees and wind gusts hitting 45 mph. Japanese forces controlled the high ground across tundra that sucked at boots and turned every uphill advance into exhausting labor. American soldiers, many drafted from warm southern states, carried three types of automatic weapons into that frozen battle: M1 Garand rifles at 9.5 pounds, Browning automatic rifles at 19.4 pounds, and M1919 Brownings at 31 pounds. Within 72 hours, the island would deliver its verdict on which design philosophy survived extreme cold. The third day of battle opened with temperatures that had dropped overnight to 19 degrees. Morning fog clung to the slopes as assault squads prepared to attack Japanese positions. 214 bars had been issued to these units, specifically for their combination of automatic fire and relative portability compared to the heavier tripod-mounted Brownings. By 1100 hours, 89 of those bars had ceased functioning entirely. The problem wasn't ice forming on external surfaces. Soldiers knew how to keep mechanisms clear of visible frost. The failure occurred inside the gas system itself, where condensed moisture from the gunner's breath and the weapon's own heat cycles froze solid in the narrow gas tube that powered the entire operating system. The physics were brutally simple. Gas-operated weapons used a small port drilled into the barrel to bleed off high-pressure gases from fired cartridges. These gases traveled through a tube roughly 0.177 inches in diameter to drive a piston that cycled the action. That narrow tube, combined with the relatively gentle pressure that made gas operation elegant in temperate conditions, created perfect conditions for ice formation in sub-freezing temperatures. Any moisture that entered the system, and moisture always entered through condensation, could freeze across that narrow aperture. Even partial blockage reduced gas flow enough to cause short stroking, where the bolt failed to travel far enough rearward to eject the spent case and chamber a fresh round. The weapon became a single-shot rifle that required manual cycling, assuming the frozen gas system hadn't seized the piston completely. Clearing a frozen bar required 15 minutes with a field stove to thaw the gas tube, then careful reassembly while wearing gloves thick enough to prevent frostbite, but thin enough to manipulate small parts. In combat, 15 minutes was eternity. Squad leaders watched helplessly as automatic fire support evaporated precisely when Japanese counterattacks materialized through the fog. Soldiers with frozen bars reverted to their M1 Garands or fixed bayonets and continued uphill with whatever worked. The M1919 Brownings kept firing. Maintenance logs from the Attu campaign documented 41 stoppages across 2,847 recoil-operated guns, a failure rate so low that armory officers initially suspected underreporting. The technical explanation revealed why Browning's primitive design succeeded, where sophisticated gas operation failed. Recoil-operated mechanisms generated violent full-stroke movement with every shot. The barrel slammed backward against heavy spring pressure. The bolt flew open with enough force to eject spent cases 15 feet. And the spring crashed everything forward again to strip a fresh round from the belt and slam it into battery. That mechanical violence was fundamentally incompatible with ice formation. Any moisture that entered a Browning's mechanism was expelled by the next shot's recoil energy. The system's heavy mass and powerful springs generated kinetic forces, measured in hundreds of foot-pounds, enough to shatter any ice crystals attempting to form on moving surfaces, where gas operation relied on capturing and channeling a portion of available energy through narrow passages. Recoil operation used the gun's entire mass as a battering ram that destroyed fouling through sheer mechanical brutality. It was the difference between trying to thread a needle with frozen fingers versus hammering heat in a nail through ice. Sergeant Thomas Doyle of the 7th Infantry Division had grown up on a Wisconsin farm where his father taught him that any tool that froze could kill you in winter. He'd kept meticulous maintenance logs since training because he understood that metal in extreme cold followed rules that differed from metal in warm weather. His M1919, which he'd named Bertha with matter-of-fact affection, developed quirks he documented carefully. She preferred slightly looser headspace in temperatures below freezing. The cold contracted metal enough that tolerances needed adjustment. She needed extra oil on the buffer spring because standard lubrication thickened into useless paste. And most critically, she ran better nearly dry than the bars ran with proper lubrication, because the violent recoil action didn't require slippery surfaces the way gas pistons did. By the time American forces secured Attu in late May, the casualty reports included numbers that had nothing to do with enemy fire. 89 soldiers had fought uphill battles with semi-automatic weapons after their bars froze, facing Japanese machine guns that kept firing because the defenders weren't attacking through open terrain. The after-action reports noted this clinical detail. Bar reliability in Arctic conditions insufficient for sustained automatic fire support. Request immediate reissue of M1919 to all assault elements. Within 2 weeks, recoil-operated Brownings were distributed to every frontline squad in Alaska Command, while gas-operated bars were reassigned to reserve units in temperate zones. Doyle wrote home in June with the plain language of someone who'd watched theory collide with reality. The Browning is ugly, heavy as sin, loud enough to deafen you. And when your bar is frozen solid and the Japanese are coming uphill in the fog, that ugly .30 caliber is the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. His maintenance logs, filled with precise notations about temperature, stoppage causes, and comparative reliability, reached Washington by July. The Ordnance Department's response was documented with bureaucratic caution. Isolated incident. Arctic conditions not representative of standard operational environments. But the Browning's trial was far from over. The recoil-operated design that had survived the frozen North was already deployed across every climate zone where American forces fought. And the next test environment would be even more hostile than Attu's ice. The Pacific Theater's humidity, heat, and corrosive salt air were waiting to deliver their own verdict on whether simplicity or sophistication survived where it mattered most. The Pacific Theater proved that humidity could be as deadly to automatic weapons as Arctic cold. Island combat from Guadalcanal to the Philippines subjected firearms to conditions that turned engineering elegance into fatal liability. Temperatures ranged from 90 to 105 degrees, with humidity levels between 85 and 95%. Salt air carried microscopic corrosive particles that found their way into every crevice and gap in mechanical assemblies. Marine Corps armorers discovered that even properly cleaned and oiled bars would develop internal pitting within 48 hours of island air exposure. Gas-operated weapons, with their narrow tubes and precision-fitted pistons, became greenhouses for rust. New Georgia Island in July of 1943 became the site of an unplanned comparative study that would reshape American automatic weapons doctrine. The 43rd Infantry Division landed with 412 M99919 Brownings, 289 bars, and 156 M1 Garands. All three weapons fired the same .30 caliber ammunition, faced the same environmental conditions, and received identical maintenance from soldiers with comparable training. After 12 days of continuous combat in 94-degree heat and near constant rain, the operational rates told a story that procurement officers in Washington could no longer dismiss as isolated incidents. 2 M19E19s remained operational at 96.4% functionality rate. Only 15 guns had been deadlined for parts replacement, primarily worn buffer springs and cracked feed pawls from sustained high-volume fire. Yet bars were still functional, a 61.2% rate. 112 guns sat deadlined, with 78 failures attributed directly to gas system corrosion that blocked or restricted the narrow tube connecting barrel to piston. M1 Garands remained operational, an 89.7% rate, with 30 rifles deadlined for gas system pitting that caused short stroking. The technical explanation revealed why Browning's supposedly primitive design dominated in tropical conditions. Gas tubes in bars and M1s measured roughly 1/16 of an inch in internal diameter, narrow enough that a single pinhole of rust could block 40% of gas flow. The high-pressure gases traveling through those tubes carried moisture and carbon residue that deposited on internal surfaces. In humid tropical air, that residue absorbed atmospheric moisture and formed corrosive compounds overnight. Even meticulous cleaning couldn't prevent microscopic pitting that gradually restricted gas flow until the weapon failed to cycle properly. The M1919's recoil mechanism used components that were bigger, chunkier, and deliberately over-engineered for abuse. The bolt weighed 1.8 pounds and was driven by a spring rated to 90 pounds of compression force. Those massive parts didn't care about surface rust or minor pitting. The bolt's momentum and the spring's violence overcame friction that would stop a gas piston dead. Where gas operation relied on channeling pressure through narrow passages that demanded cleanliness, recoil operation simply hammered through contamination with brute mechanical force. Corporal James McWilliams of the 164th Infantry had been a bank clerk in North Dakota before the war, and he brought an accountant's compulsive precision to jungle combat. His waterproof notebook contained entries that would later become primary source documents for post-war reliability studies. Each weapon stoppage, cleaning interval, and parts failure was recorded with the same methodical detail he'd once applied to loan applications. The August 15, 1943 entry was typical of his approach. Bar 7738 removed gas plug. Discovered green corrosion blocking 70% of tube diameter. Reamed clear with cleaning rod. Weapon functioned for 47 rounds before seizing again on short stroke. Swapped for M19E19 ARG 42891. Fired 2,400 rounds across 4 days. 0 stoppages. Gun exterior shows heavy wear and surface rust, but continues cycling normally. McWilliams had learned on Guadalcanal that reliable weapons were the difference between survival and death. His entire squad had been killed in the first week except for himself and the M1919 gunner, an event that convinced him that documenting weapon performance was more important than any other record-keeping he'd ever done. His 18-month maintenance log covered 47 different weapons across New Georgia and Philippines campaigns, tracking patterns that individual soldiers couldn't see. M1919 stoppages clustered around ammunition problems, bad production lots with inconsistent powder charges, corroded belts that caused feed issues, or damaged cartridges that failed to extract. BR stoppages clustered around the weapon itself, gas system fouling, recoil spring fatigue, and extractor breakage from the additional stress of fighting through reduced gas pressure. The pattern pointed to a fundamental design truth that procurement theory had missed. Gas-operated weapons added complexity in exchange for theoretical advantages that disappeared under field conditions. The weight savings of gas operation, HE2U, 19-pound bar versus a 31-pound M1919 meant nothing when the lighter weapons spent 60% of combat time deadlined for maintenance. The reduced felt recoil of gas operation was irrelevant when the gun wouldn't cycle, and the elegant engineering of capturing barrel gases became a fatal flaw when tropical humidity turned those narrow gas passages into rust-producing chambers. In October of 1943, the Marine Corps Gazette published an article titled "Automatic Weapons: Reliability Under Tropical Conditions" that represented the first official acknowledgement of recoil operation superiority, where combat conditions tested design philosophy at scale. The article's conclusion was carefully worded but unmistakable. Comparative field data indicates that recoil-operated crew-served weapons demonstrate significantly higher operational readiness rates than gas-operated designs in high-humidity environments. Recommendation: prioritize recoil-operated machine guns for Pacific Theater deployment. Army Ordnance responded with bureaucratic subtlety, quietly revising procurement priorities without admitting that 60 years of gas operation consensus had been wrong. Gas-operated designs would continue for rifles, where individual soldiers needed portable weapons and could perform detailed maintenance between engagements. But for machine guns, crew-served weapons where reliability was literally life and death, where sustained fire support determined whether assaults succeeded or failed, Browning's dismissed recoil system became the institutional standard. The change happened in production schedules and supply requisitions rather than official announcements. But every combat unit in the Pacific watched their weapons mix shift toward the guns that kept firing when everything else stopped. The M2 Browning proved Browning's recoil design at its most extreme scale. Chambered in .50 caliber and weighing 84 pounds without mount or ammunition, the M2 was recoil operation scaled up to aircraft and vehicle use. It fired rounds half an inch in diameter at rates between 450 and 550 per minute, with effective range exceeding 2,000 yards. By mid-1944, the 8th Air Force was flying 1,000-bomber raids over Germany, and each B-17 Flying Fortress carried 13 M2 Brownings distributed across waist positions, tail turrets, ball turrets, and nose guns. That meant roughly 7,800 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition per aircraft and 13 independent firing positions that needed to function flawlessly at 25,000 feet, where temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and oxygen levels required crews to wear masks. Luftwaffe pilots began reporting something unexpected in their combat debriefs. American gunners sustained fire longer than German gunners in comparable defensive situations. The observation puzzled German intelligence because training quality was roughly equivalent, and ammunition supplies were similar. The answer wasn't training or logistics. It was mechanical. German bombers used MG-131 machine guns in 13mm caliber, which were recoil-operated like Browning's design, and MG-151 cannon in 20mm, which used gas operation for higher power output. The MG-151s delivered devastating hitting power when they worked, but Luftwaffe armory records documented stoppage rates between 8% and 12% during sustained fire sequences due to gas system overheating at high altitude. American B-17 gunners filed 23,000 combat reports between January and June of 1944. M2. Browning's stoppage rate during those engagements measured 2.1%. The technical explanation revealed why Browning's recoil system dominated at altitude, where temperature, pressure, and sustained fire created conditions that defeated sophisticated engineering. The M2 used the gun's own violence to stay clean. Every shot generated such powerful barrel movement, 0.75 inches of rearward recoil travel, that carbon fouling was literally shaken loose before it could accumulate. The mechanism could fire 200-round bursts without cleaning, a capability that gas-operated designs couldn't match because their narrow gas passages would choke on carbon. deposits long before reaching that volume. Technical Sergeant Robert Harper of the 91st Bomb Group had been a Lutheran minister's son from Iowa before the war, and he approached B-17 gunnery with monk-like discipline. Between missions, he spent hours disassembling, cleaning, and understanding every component of his waist gun M2s, believing that mechanical excellence was a form of moral duty to his crew. Other gunners noticed his methods, and his waist position became an informal training station where nervous replacements learned that steady maintenance created steady fire. Harper's special talent was mechanical diagnosis under combat conditions. He could identify stoppage types by sound and feel even in darkness. At altitude, while wearing oxygen masks and sheepskin gloves thick, enough to prevent frostbite but barely, thin enough to manipulate charging handles and feed. Mechanisms. His 94 mission record with 0 M2 failures became legend in the 91st. 3 separate fighter attacks had been survived because Harper cleared stoppages that weren't actually his gun's fault, damaged ammunition, twisted feed chutes, or debris in the belt, while other positions went silent. He'd watched B-17s drop out of formation with guns that stopped firing at the worst possible moments, and he'd concluded that the difference between survival and death often came down to whether a gunner understood his weapon well enough to diagnose problems in seconds while fighters closed to firing range. The M2's mechanical simplicity made that understanding possible. 44 parts total: barrel, bolt, spring, and feed mechanism. A gunner could learn every component's function and failure mode in ways that complex gas-operated systems made impossible. Harper wrestled with theological questions that disturbed his sleep between missions. Whether praying for weapons to keep killing was compatible with Christian teaching occupied his thoughts during the long bomber streams to target. He eventually concluded that protecting his crew was the prayer that mattered. The keeping his M2 functioning was how he served both God and the 9 other men whose lives depended on defensive fire. That resolution let him serve with clear conscience through missions where sustained bursts heated his gun barrel to glowing. Red and smoke rose from his gloves when he touched metal surfaces. The M2 kept cycling through that abuse because its recoil system didn't care about heat the way gas-operated mechanisms did. By early 1945, the air war over Europe was effectively won. B-17s flew in formations so large that Luftwaffe fighters rarely pressed attacks home. But ground combat revealed a new challenge that critics seized upon as evidence that Browning's design was obsolete. German MG-42s were outpacing M19-19s in pure cyclic rate. The MG-42 fired 1/200 rounds per minute using gas operation and complex engineering that required over 150 parts. The M19-19 fired 400 to 500 rounds per minute with its simple recoil mechanism and 42 parts. Procurement. Memos argued that the war had proven rate of fire mattered more than reliability. Modern combat demands suppressive volume, the analysis stated. Mechanical simplicity cannot compensate for insufficient cyclic rate. The criticism gained traction in Washington offices where procurement officials had never heard an MG-42's distinctive ripping sound or watched German gunners struggle to keep the weapon fed and functional under sustained use. The high cyclic rate that impressed observers on firing ranges became a liability in combat, where ammunition supply, barrel changes, and mechanical stress determined whether weapons remained operational through extended engagements. 1/200 round per minute cyclic rate meant burning through a 250 round belt in 12.5 seconds. That created 3 immediate problems. First, ammunition consumption. At that rate, an MG-42 gunner could exhaust his squad's entire basic load in under 10 minutes of sustained fire. The M19-19's slower rate meant the same ammunition lasted 25 minutes, crucial in defensive positions where resupply was impossible. Second, barrel life. The MG-42 required barrel changes every 150 to 200 rounds to prevent overheating. The M1919 could fire 600 rounds before needing barrel changes. In practice, this meant MG-42 crews spent more time changing barrels than firing, while Browning crews maintained steady fire. Third, mechanical stress. The MG-42's complex gas system and 150-part mechanism meant more components experiencing violent forces. Higher parts count meant higher failure probability. The math was unforgiving, but those realities were difficult to quantify in peacetime analysis. And the institutional momentum toward complex, high-rate-of-fire gas operation was building again, just as it had before Attu, before New Georgia, before the numbered missions over Germany had proven. Otherwise, the final accounting would need to wait until someone compiled combat data at a scale large enough to settle the question permanently. In June of 1945, U.S. Army Ordnance conducted the largest automatic weapons study in military history. 94,000 after-action reports from the European theater, Pacific theater, and Mediterranean theater were compiled, covering every major engagement from Normandy to Okinawa. The analysis was designed to answer three questions that had generated 40 years of institutional debate. Which design principle produced lower stoppage rates under field conditions? Which system required less maintenance during sustained combat operations? And which guns remained operational longer under continuous use? The data would either vindicate 6 decades of gas operation, consensus, or prove that Browning's dismissed recoil system had been correct all along. The stoppage rate analysis measured failures per 10,000. Rounds fired across all combat conditions and theaters. M1919 Brownings recorded 8.7 stoppages per 10,000 rounds, M2. Brownings recorded 9.4 stoppages per 10,000 rounds. Browning automatic rifles recorded 31.2 stoppages per 10,000 rounds. Captured German MG-42s, analyzed from battlefield recovery and interrogation of Wehrmacht armorers, showed 18.9 stoppages per 10,000 rounds. The pattern was unmistakable. Recoil-operated crew-served weapons outperformed gas-operated designs by factors ranging from 2.1 to more than 3.1, depending on the specific comparison. Maintenance interval data revealed an even starker difference. M1919s averaged 2,400 rounds between required cleaning that interrupted combat operations. BRs. Required cleaning every 800 rounds to maintain. Reliability, MG-42s, needed cleaning every 500 rounds, according to Wehrmacht maintenance protocols. The explanation was mechanical rather than metallurgical. Gas-operated weapons accumulated carbon fouling in their narrow gas tubes and piston assemblies at rates that eventually choked off the pressure needed for reliable cycling. Recoil-operated weapons expelled fouling through the violence of their own operation, with each shot's barrel movement and bolt impact shaking loose deposits before they could build to critical levels. Operational life expectancy measured how many rounds a weapon could fire before requiring major parts replacement rather than routine maintenance. M1919s averaged 95,000 rounds before needing barrel replacement. Bolt replacement or spring replacement M2s averaged 127,000 rounds before major parts. Failure.bars averaged 42,000 rounds before gas system components or operating rods required replacement. The data pointed to a fundamental truth about mechanical design under stress. Fewer parts meant fewer failure points, and simpler mechanisms tolerated. Wear that would disable complex systems. The report's conclusion was written in careful, bureaucratic language that nonetheless represented a complete reversal of 60 years of institutional consensus. Recoil-operated designs demonstrate superior reliability across all environmental conditions due to reduced component count and increased mechanical tolerance for fouling, corrosion, and wear. Gas-operated systems offer theoretical advantages in weight reduction and felt recoil, but demonstrate higher failure rates under sustained combat use. Recommendation: recoil operation should be considered the primary design principle for future crew-served automatic weapons development. The vindication came too late for Browning, who'd died in 1926 believing that institutional inertia would never fully embrace his designs. But it came in time to shape the next century of American military firearms. Technical Sergeant Raymond Jacobs of the 1st Infantry Division had landed at Omaha Beach in the 3rd Wave on June 6, 1944. He'd watched half his company cut down in 20 minutes of German machine gun fire that swept the beach in methodical traversing patterns. He'd concluded that morning that the only honest way to honor the dead was to remember exactly what happened, without embellishment or mythology, and he'd kept a detailed journal documenting not heroics but mundane details: serial numbers, maintenance schedules, ammunition expenditure, and the daily survival of objects under extraordinary stress. His M1919 carried serial number 44827. That gun went from Normandy, hedgerows to Aachene's urban ruins to the Rhine crossing. 11 months of continuous combat. The barrel was replaced twice after. Extended fire missions that left the rifling worn. Smooth. The buffer spring was replaced once after it began showing compression. Fatigue that affected cycling speed. The extractor was replaced 3 times after breakage from sustained use, but the bolt, barrel extension, and receiver, the core components of Browning's recoil system, never required replacement. Jacobs brought the gun home to Chicago and preserved it in his garage as a physical memorial to the 11 months that had kept him and his squad alive. Between 1941 and 1945, U.S. factories manufactured 2.08 million M1919 Brownings and 400,000 M2 Brownings, 2.48 million recoil-operated machine guns total. Those weapons fired an estimated 12.8 billion rounds in combat across every theater where American forces fought. The documented stoppage rate across all platforms, conditions, and operators measured 3.2%. No competing design, American, British, German, or Soviet, matched that reliability figure. The numbers represented more than engineering triumph. They represented the survival of soldiers who'd been issued weapons. That worked when nothing else did. The M2 Browning. The John Moses Browning had designed in 1921, the gun that procurement officers had called obsolete in favor of gas. Operation remained in U.S. military service for the next 100 years. Some M2s manufactured in 1933 were still operational in Pacific Shore batteries at war's end. Guns that had fired over 200,000 rounds each without catastrophic failure. Gas operation produced 19 major military designs adopted by various nations between 1900 and 1945. Browning's recoil operation produced 6 major military designs in the same period. By the year 2000, every gas-operated design from that era had been retired and replaced. The M2 remained in service. The explanation wasn't institutional favoritism or American exceptionalism. It was physics and probability. Gas-operated weapons required multiple precision-fitted components working in perfect coordination. Recoil-operated weapons used mass and momentum, forces that didn't care about dirt, rust, heat, cold, or the passage of decades. Modern militaries have attempted to replace the M2 repeatedly. In the 1980s, advanced polymer-cased ammunition and electronically controlled fire systems promised to obsolete Browning's century-old design. The programs were canceled when field testing revealed that new systems couldn't match the M2's fundamental reliability. In the 2000s, lighter-weight alternatives using titanium components and advanced metallurgy were developed. None achieved the M2's service life expectancy or tolerance for abuse. The U.S. military now operates M2s manufactured across 8 decades. A gunner in Afghanistan might fire a weapon built in 1945, rebuilt in 1968, upgraded in 1991, and still functioning perfectly in 2015. The design's mechanical simplicity makes this longevity possible. With proper maintenance, an M2's core components, barrel, bolt, receiver, can serve indefinitely. What made Browning's recoil operation revolutionary wasn't clever engineering or advanced materials. It was philosophical clarity about how machines survive stress. Every automatic weapon must solve the same problem: extract energy from a fired cartridge to eject the spent case and chamber a fresh round. The conventional approach, gas operation, intercepted expanding gases mid-barrel, routed them through tubes and pistons, and converted pressure into mechanical motion. Browning saw that this added unnecessary components between cause and effect. The gun was already moving backward from recoil. Why not use that motion directly? His solution eliminated the gas tube, the piston, the adjustment screws, the seals, everything that captured gas but also captured dirt, moisture, and complexity. What remained was elemental: a barrel that moved, a bolt that opened, a spring that closed everything again. The mechanism was violent. It slammed and crashed and shook. But that violence was the solution, not a problem. Ice couldn't form because the gun shattered it with every shot. Rust couldn't accumulate because the mechanism hammered through it. Carbon fouling couldn't build up because each cycle expelled it. Gas operation was elegant. Recoil operation was brutal. Elegance failed in foxholes. Brutality survived. John Moses Browning died in 1926 in Belgium while working on a pistol design for Fabrique Nationale. His obituaries praised his lever-action rifles and pump shotguns, the sporting guns that made him wealthy and famous. His automatic weapons were mentioned as interesting military work but not as defining achievement. He never knew that his dismissed recoil system would become the foundation of American automatic weapons doctrine for a century. He never saw the combat data from Attu or New Georgia, or the bomber streams over Germany that proved his simple mechanism, superior to sophisticated gas operation. He died believing the institutional consensus against recoil operation would outlast his designs. He was wrong. The M1919 served from 1919 to 1957 in U.S. service and continued in Allied militaries for decades after. The M2 entered service in 1933 and remains operational in 2024-91, years of continuous military use with no replacement in sight. That longevity represents the ultimate validation of Browning's insight. Simplicity survives complexity. Mechanisms that use natural forces outlast mechanisms that fight them. Designs that eliminate parts eliminate failures. Modern engineers call this principle graceful degradation, the idea that systems should continue functioning even when damaged or degraded. An M2 with surface rust, worn springs, and pitted metal will still cycle. A gas-operated weapon with a blocked tube becomes a club. The principle extends beyond firearms. Industrial machinery, aerospace systems, and infrastructure design now explicitly incorporate lessons that Browning understood intuitively. Fewer moving parts, looser tolerances, and mechanisms that use force rather than redirect it create systems that survive real-world conditions. Browning developed his recoil-operated concept in a workshop in Ogden, Utah, far from the military academies and arms manufacturers that dominated automatic weapons development. He had no formal engineering education. His training came from his father, a frontier gunsmith who'd immigrated from Tennessee with tools and skill but no credentials. That background was considered a liability by military procurement officers who favored European designs backed by royal patents and academic engineering. But it gave Browning something those designers lacked: freedom from institutional assumptions. European arms manufacturers worked within traditions that said automatic weapons required gas operation because that's what Hiram Maxim had proven successful. Browning, working alone in Utah, didn't care what European tradition said. He cared what worked. His workshop method was empirical rather than theoretical. Build a prototype. Fire 1,000 rounds. Document failures. Modify the design. Repeat. He spent years iterating on recoil mechanisms, trying different barrel lengths, spring weights, and locking systems until he found combinations that worked. Reliably, the experts who dismissed his 1900 prototype had never fired 1,000 rounds through their gas-operated designs under field conditions. They'd calculated theoretical advantages but hadn't tested them against mud, rain, cold, or sustained use. Browning had. And the difference between calculated theory and tested reality would take 40 years and a world war to prove definitively. On a firing range in 2024, an M2 Browning manufactured in 1943 sits mounted on a modern vehicle. The gun is 81 years old. Its barrel has been replaced 4 times. Its springs have been upgraded once. But its core mechanism, the barrel that moves backward, the bolt that opens, the spring that slams everything forward, remains unchanged from Browning's original 1921 design. A young machine gunner, born decades after the Cold War ended, learns the weapon the same way Technical Sergeant Harper did in 1944. Disassemble, clean, reassemble. Understand each part's function. Respect the mechanism's brutal simplicity. When the gun fires, the barrel slams backward with violence that would shatter a gas-operated weapon's precision components. The bolt crashes open, ejecting the spent case 15 feet. The spring drives everything forward with 90 pounds of force, stripping a fresh round from the belt and slamming it into battery. Lock, fire, repeat, 1/10 of a second per cycle. No gas tube, no piston. No adjustment screws, just barrel, bolt, and spring, the same mechanism that was called mechanically unsound in 1900. The same design that institutional consensus dismissed for 40 years. The same recoil-operated principle that proved itself across frozen tundra, tropical jungles, and 25,000-foot altitude. The gun keeps firing because it does one thing perfectly. It uses physics instead of fighting it. That was Browning's genius. Not complexity or sophistication, but clarity about what actually matters when everything else fails. The experts in 1900 were wrong. The procurement officers who favored gas operation were wrong. The critics who said rate of fire mattered more than reliability were wrong. John Moses Browning, the Mormon gunsmith from Utah who built prototypes in his workshop and tested them until they worked, was right, and a century later, his dismissed idea remains the deadliest machine gun design in American military history, not because it was the most advanced or the most elegant, but because it was the simplest, the mechanism that keeps firing when everything else stops.